We've moved from the creation of liberalism as a philosophy to liberalism as a technique, as a way of engineering society. And as we said, there were three great practical discoveries that went with the development of liberal political economy. The first, the idea of the market, exemplified by Adam Smith's writings. The second, constitutional engineering. And there we looked at Madison and Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. And now today we take the third, perhaps less known to you, but a set of ideas that go very deep in our culture, utilitarianism. And the father of these ideas is a gentleman by the name of Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher who lived between 1748 and 1833. Now, you know the name Adam Smith. You know the name of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, of course. Jeremy Bentham is apt to be a bit more obscure to you. So let me tell you a little bit about him. As you can see, he lived, well, he was born almost contemporaneously with Rousseau's writings, so he's a little later. But he comes into prominence at about the same time as Adam Smith and Thomas Jefferson. His first great writing, The Fragment on Government, dates from 1776. His second great book, The Principles of Morals and Legislation, from 1789. So his writings coincide with the two great revolutions that start the liberal movement in European history. He was trained as a lawyer, but he never practiced it. He lived on his writings and his family fortune, and he became something of a celebrity because his ideas coincided perfectly with the era in which reform, liberal ideas were in the air in England from 1820 to 1840. And he was just a spark plug of ideas. He created all sorts, or suggested all sorts of reforms. And his ideas were not immediate. It was rather that he had influence on the spirit of his time, on the circle of people who formed the movement that became known as utilitarianism. Many of his reforms were good and admirable. Many of them were just plain quirky. I mean, he designed a prison, the main feature of which was that the wardens could sit in the middle and watch everybody at all times in the prison so that nobody could conceivably get away and escape. He had all kinds of bizarre ideas. Well, one of the most interesting ones is that in his will, he said that he was not to be buried, but stuffed and mounted in a glass case so that if any of his disciples wanted to discuss the principles of utilitarianism, they could just wheel him out and he would be party to the conversation. This is actually true, incidentally. If you're ever in London, and you very well might be, you can meet Jeremy Bentham at University College London, where he still is in his glass case. And what you do is you walk in the front door of University College, turn right at the tea room, and you just pass by the tea room, and on the left is this glass case. Now, you have to first take, what happens is the undergraduates have gotten in the habit of throwing their books and their coats and things on poor old Jeremy, so you have to sort of clear them away. But sure enough, there's Jeremy, and you can just go and see him today. He's a little man, about so tall, just bright, cherubic face, expressing just even after 150 years of taxidermy, all of the joy and the optimism that comes with the Enlightenment. Well, there are a number of terms that go with Jeremy Bentham. One, he is the father of utilitarianism, and we better define what that means, because it's a word you'll hear many times again. Basically, utilitarianism means that the social good, the good of society, is revealed in the utility or the usefulness of policies to the needs and desires of individuals. Now, that's pretty basic liberalism, but as we'll see, it has a special cast to it. Utilitarianism means that the best social good is the utility that society offers to the individuals who are members of it. And that's one element. Another term that's connected with Bentham that you'll sometimes hear, I think it's in your readings, is philosophic radicalism. Now, that's not to be misunderstood. I mean, it sounds like these fellows were out throwing bombs and things, which they were not. Philosophic radicalism is just a more advanced form of liberalism when you read about it in the history of ideas. These are liberals who took their liberalism very seriously and very actively. You can distinguish it, I think, by thinking of classic liberalism, of the John Locke variety, as, well, suggesting a kind of passive state, that the job of government is to sort of keep order, keep the peace, but the market and individual initiatives will do the rest. The radicals were the people who were primarily identified with the idea that we've suggested was so much a part of liberalism in the first part of the 19th century, in England as in America, activist, planning, trying to create liberal society by intentional reforms. Well, even today, for example, the French liberals are called the Radical Party. And in Argentina, for example, the new democratic government of Argentina is called the Radical, it comes under the Radical Party. And you'll hear this term around the world and it may confuse you. You may think it's a Marxist party. Actually, these are the heirs of General B. Bentham. These are parties that identify with the kind of utilitarian liberalism that Bentham professed. Now, what was Bentham's teaching? What is his legacy to us? And it surrounds a central ideal of Bentham that all of politics could be reduced to a science, and that you could create a theory of scientific legislation in which basically what you'd be doing, in effect, would be legislating according to almost a mathematical formula. It was, again, this engineering mentality of early liberalism is fascinating. And here you see what Bentham is proposing is what he called the philippic calculus, a mathematics of legislation, of policy making for his society. Now, in a sense, Bentham is the liberal theorist of the policymaker or the statesman, as Locke was of the citizen. Locke thought on behalf of the citizen and asked, how does the citizen judge whether the government that he or she is living in is a good government or a bad government? The doctrine of individual rights is a doctrine of consent. Under what conditions ought I to follow government? Under what conditions ought I to protest? But Bentham's teaching is addressed to the legislator. What's a good law? What's a good policy? How should one go about the task of governing other people? And he felt that this was something that was no longer a matter of skill or art, but it could be reduced to a form of mathematics. Now, Bentham's idea of the philippic calculus really took as its ideal the notion that the object of law and policy was to create the greatest good for the greatest number. That was the object. You've heard the phrase many times, but reflect on it. It doesn't mean quite what it seems to mean. You'll hear people say it all the time because we've inherited that phrase as part of our folklore from Bentham. We should do the greatest good for the greatest number. It does not mean majority rule, by the way. It means the greatest good in relation to the greatest number, but what you're really striving for is to create the greatest sum of happiness for society as a whole. It's not that you're doing the greatest good for the most people. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. The greatest sum of happiness distributed as widely as possible. Now, if you look at the theoretical background for this, you can see how it emerges from the whole liberal tradition that we've been discussing. As the rational individual calculates his or her own personal self-interest, that basic teaching, back to Hobbes, back to Locke, rationalism is the pursuit of self-interest by careful calculation. You make your life plan by choosing from the opportunities that are available to you those that most satisfy you. Way back to Hobbes's psychology of man as a seeker of pleasure and avoider of pain. This is still built into Bentham. But now Bentham says if that is true for the individual, then what society should seek is to convert that into a formula for the whole. So if the individual is seeking rationally to satisfy his or her own self-interest, then the purpose of society should be to maximize the self-interest of all of the individuals in society to achieve the optimum level of satisfaction for society as a whole. Now, the only guide to legislation then would be to maximize what citizens, in their own estimation, regarded as pleasurable or good, and to minimize what they would find painful or bad. Hobbes's principle just carried out as a principle of legislation. This is the objective. Now, a few things go with this that are very important in understanding the implications of Benthamism. First, to Bentham, all individuals were equal. And this comes early in the game. Each is to count for one and none for more than one, he taught. Now, this is at a period when we are just barely moving to democracy. Bentham is really one of the first of the radical Democrats who really did believe in total human equality. Jefferson really didn't, you know. I mean, he accepted slavery. The founders of the American Republic insisted on property requirements for voters. But Bentham starts by taking the liberal message to its logical conclusion that each individual had an equal entitlement and an equal right to pursue pleasure and to avoid pain. Hence, each person's pleasures and pains counted equally. Now, already you see a little bit of a tension with the Adam Smith's ideal of the market, because in a market that generates inequality of incomes naturally, some people's pleasures and pains count for more, I mean, as they have more money to vote with in the market relationship. So the market ideal and the utilitarian ideal, they're both involved in the conversation of liberalism, but they have slightly different implications even at this point. Now, the second thing, yes, all people are equal in terms of the calculus of the greatest good for the greatest number. No one has superior pleasures or pains, but at the same time, no form of happiness, no particular pleasure or pain is greater or is better or worse than any other. In other words, all pleasures and all pains are created equal, because we're trying for the sum of happiness in society. Now, to express this, Bentham used the phrase, poetry is as good as pushpin. I wondered for years what pushpin was, until I went to an English pub one day and saw people just playing a little game, sort of like tiddlywinks, in which you take two English pennies and you flip one with the other and see if you can hit a target. The original name was push penny. And what Bentham was saying is, you may think poetry is, you, the sophisticated intellectual, thinks reading poetry is so wonderful, and these people down at the country bar playing push penny are nothing. But each one is a pleasure, each counts the same. I guess a modern equivalent would be to say, from Bentham's point of view, publicly subsidized symphonies on TV are no better, or on public TV are no better or worse than professional football or professional wrestling. If you like watching professional football, that's equally good as watching the symphony. So Bentham was opposed to cultural elitism. He's opposed to the notion that somehow you should elevate the taste of society, that somehow people have better tastes. He is a Democrat in this other sense of saying the tastes of the average man are as important as those of the elite. Beer is as important as champagne. Country taverns are as important as music theaters, and so on. Now, once again, in Bentham, we see that constant relativism of liberalism. No individual knows what's better for another individual. No individual knows the good. That question we spent the whole first semester on, what is the good for man, sort of disappears. Liberalism refuses to answer it. What it tries to do is, given that the individual is the source of all value, how do you create a political theory that makes sense? So the job of politics is to give people what they want, not what an elite thinks is good for them. And in this sense, Bentham is very democratic, and in this sense also you're going to see an interesting contrast between Bentham and John Stuart Mill when you come to him. Now, Bentham got down to practice very quickly. This was his theory. This was his doctrine. All pleasures are equal. Society should try to get the greatest good for the greatest number. But now he's proposing a practical way of getting there. And what does this look like? What does this technique of government look like? Well, Bentham himself was particularly interested in legal reform. And his view was that the law, which was a real mess in the England of the 1800 to 1830 period, feudal survivals accompanied with a growing and emerging contract law, that law should be simple, comprehensible, and easy to understand. We talked earlier about that movement in English law that took place as part of the reforms of the 1820s to 1840s toward a law of contract that set the stage for the free market in a society of free individuals. Well, Bentham was one of the reformers who anticipated this and spoke for it. And his view was that law was basically a matter of incentives and disincentives, that crime and punishment were a problem of individual choice, just like as liberals would think of anything. And that what you were really doing with the law was structuring people's choices so that they would be socially responsible, so that they would work toward social benefit. So in a sense, what you're doing is seeing an individual considering, contemplating a crime, thinking in terms of both the severity and the certainty of getting, the certainty of getting caught and the severity of the potential sentence. So you try to visualize a burglar or somebody about to rob a bank, and the person is saying, well, it looks easy enough. There's no watchman around. I need the money. I've got a gun. The teller looks like the flighty type. This should all work out okay. But on the other hand, I don't know just how many police there are in the area, and if I'm caught, what are the chances that my lawyer is going to get me off? And do I really want to spend 5 years in Waupun? Now, you see that calculus going on. And Bentham's view was that a perfect law would be, notice how this follows from pleasures and pains and the principle of the hedonic calculus, would be perfectly calculated to deter crime by inflicting the minimum amount of pain. So you didn't want excessive pain. The purpose of law wasn't revenge or retribution. It was just to keep people from committing crimes. So if you could calculate exactly the right amount of penalty that would go with each crime to keep people from committing that crime, you would have accomplished the philippic calculus. You would have calculated that law which would create the greatest good for the greatest number. If it wasn't enough to deter crime, you'd have more pain than pleasure. If the penalties were so severe that they were unnecessarily harsh to accomplish the goal of law, you would again have more pain than necessary for the society. You were trying to fine-tune the law. Bentham, for example, at that point, opposed capital punishment for pickpocketing. Well, at that time in the 1820s in England, you could be hanged for over 200 offenses, ranging from stealing a pair of pants to pickpocketing and whatnot. And it was a very draconian system of justice. The only problem was that nobody actually hanged people for minor offenses. Juries wouldn't convict people of that crime. And Bentham noticed that at public executions, there was a very high amount of pickpocketing going on. So he figured that somehow the threat of hanging was not sufficient to deter people from pickpocketing, and that if you had a lot more police around who could pick up the pickpocketers and give them a few years in the brig, that would probably do the job. Well, interestingly enough, even today, we still discuss law in very Benthamite terms. We ask the question with regard to crime in America, would we be better with more police, with a reform of the criminal justice system so that people who committed crimes would in fact be quickly tried and subject to punishment? Some people argue that failing that, We need to restore capital punishment, make penalties harsher, lock up criminals and keep them off the streets so as to throw terror into their hearts. We do debate in very Benthamite language whether severity or certainty is the best way of accomplishing the goals of preventing crime. Now, in this sense, Bentham inspired legal reform, worked with legal reform. He felt it was all an automatic process. He thought you could write a legal code for a country you'd never seen. In fact, he wrote a legal code for Poland. He'd never been in Poland, didn't know anything about the customs of Poland. He didn't know anything about the traditions of Poland. But he thought, fine, anybody can do this thing. All you need to know are the principles of law. It is universal. It applies to all people. His system would work for anything. Now, as I say, Bentham was most interested in legal reform. But at the same time, we know him mainly as the father of modern political economy or modern economics. And if you look at the modern discipline of economics as it's taught, say, at the University of Wisconsin, it rests very largely on a utilitarian foundation. Economics is a discipline of carefully calculated more and less. One of the fathers of modern economics is Adam Smith. But of modern technical economics, well, perhaps the real father is Jeremy Bentham. If you walk over to Social Science Building and take a few courses in economics, you will be seeing in very large measure the elaboration of the teachings of this very unusual and peculiar English political philosopher. In the practice of modern government, and utilitarianism most often takes the form of what is called the cost-benefit analysis. And this is really part of day-to-day administration and policy making in the United States and in all modern governments. And in this sense, what is said, what is taught in our own La Follette Institute, what you would learn if you wanted to get a master's degree in public administration, is that the proper way to devise a good public policy is to calculate all the costs and all the benefits for all the alternatives that are available to you of accomplishing a specific purpose, and then to choose that policy with the greatest surplus of benefits over costs. That's a general formula, but it can be worked out into quite a technique. Say, for example, you were in the Corps of Engineers, and you were concerned about where to locate a dam on a river. You're going to build a new dam. And there were 5 possible sites for the dam. And how would you choose which one was the best place to put it? Well, in terms of classic cost-benefit analysis, you would first estimate all the costs for each of the 5 feasible sites. That would include, obviously, the cost of construction. It would include the interest on the money you'd have to borrow or the taxes that you'd have to raise for the construction period, and the cost of not using that money for some other public project. It would include the cost of labor. It would include the cost of relocating the people who would be dispossessed if you build a huge reservoir up here. It would include a few other things, administrative costs and so forth, but you could quickly calculate just what the costs of a dam like that might be. On the other hand, then you could calculate the benefits of this kind of public policy for the 5 sites on the river. Flood control. What would be the value in not having the floodplain flooded each year? How would property values increase? What new crops could go in? How could the land be developed if this wasn't going to flood downstream any further? Irrigation. How could the water be used to make agriculture more profitable in the region? Navigation. What would be the value added if this river were navigable and became a transportation artery part of the year? Recreation. How many tourists might use the lake behind the dam for touristic purposes, and how might that contribute to the local economy of the area? How many jobs might that add? How might local commerce improve? So you could take those 2 calculations, the costs and the benefits, and you would choose then if you could make this all come out in some way that anybody would believe, and you choose that site that had the greatest level of benefits over costs. Well, in doing that, what you would be doing would be meeting Bentham's formula. You would be providing the greatest good, the greatest satisfaction, the greatest benefit to the greatest number, because society as a whole would be benefiting in the sense that you were choosing the most economical option, the most efficient option, that one that most enhanced economic growth. Now you can do this for anything. You can do a cost-benefit analysis on any kind of public problem. For example, let's say, we'll take a wonderful way that nobody's thought of yet for saving the money. We're all trying to reduce the federal deficit. We're trying to save money, trying to think of government programs to cut out. Well, I can think of one that even David Stockman hasn't thought of yet. We could simply stop delivering the mail. Now, you immediately blanch, but now think of it realistically and compare the costs and the benefits. If everybody picked up their mail at the post office, instead of having people go out and deliver the mail, you'd obviously save a lot of money. The government could sell all those trucks. It could send off all those mailmen into private employment, where they would obviously be better for the economy and so forth. Now, what you do is you say, okay, now here are the benefits. Government savings to government. And you could factor in some other things, such as the human factor of meeting at the post office instead of sitting in lonely isolation waiting for the postman to come. People would get together in the city square. It would renew downtown commerce. Everybody would have to come downtown to pick up their mail. It'd be good for business because people would do shopping trips. You could make a monetary estimate of this. And against this, you'd measure the costs. Now, you don't have just a mail truck. Everybody's got to get into their car or on their motorcycle and go down. So you got to take the energy costs. You got to talk about the cost in time. You're going to lose some labor cost. All those people going to pick up their own mail. And, you can just factor this out. Now, in the end, I really have never done this. I mean, it might be cost efficient. It might meet Bentham's criterion to do this, or it might not. Well, as I say, one begins to practice this, and wherever you go in modern government, you will hear this language spoken. We can ask the question in many different ways. The economist will ask you, for example, would you prefer to have, say, 2 or 3% inflation and thereby achieve a growth rate of 4% if you have an 8% unemployment rate? Or is unemployment so important to you that you would prefer, say, to run 10% inflation with a possible loss in some GNP, which you might lose or might not, so that you could bring the unemployment rate down to 4%? Now, that's the conventional question of modern macroeconomics or Keynesian economics, which we'll study in a few weeks. And sure enough, once again, what you're looking at is the old question. Which of those alternatives will yield the greatest benefit for the greatest number? Now, this way of looking at the world does have some difficulties with it. The greatest difficulty of utilitarianism and cost-benefit analysis, or anything like it, of modern economics, well, there are two levels of difficulty. One is really philosophical, and the other is quite practical. The philosophic difficulty is this. Theoretically, what you're weighing in all of this is the pleasures and pains of different individuals as they sense them, as they are important to the individual. But the problem is, how do you know what makes another individual happy? How do you know how important different satisfactions are to different people? For example, is one person's pleasure in owning and flying a private airplane that's going to cost at least $20,000 greater or less than the pleasure another person might take in just taking a walk in the country? The walk in the country costs nothing. The private airplane is very expensive. For one individual who hates walking, the plane may be terribly important. For another individual, they wouldn't, the plane would give them no pleasure at all. They hate flying, they're afraid of it. And the walk in the country, which is free, is a pleasure that's so valuable that they wouldn't give it up for anything. Well, this is the great philosophic difficulty. How do you compare the pleasures and pains of individuals who are unknown. Bentham never answered the question. He thought that you could compare pleasures and pains in terms of certain categories, like intensity, duration, certainty. But that only moves the question another step. For example, what's more important to you, to anyone? An intense thrill of a short duration, like watching a rocket go off, or a lifetime supply of ice cream, which is certain, low I know your answer, which is certain, low intensity, but of long duration. Well, can you really answer that for yourself, for anyone else? Sometimes the ascent to the top of the mountain for a mystic, the moment at the top of a mountain, maybe the peak experience of a lifetime, they'd give up anything for that. For another person, the homey day-to-day pleasures are more important. They wouldn't go out of their way to climb a Himalaya if you gave it to them. And so we don't really know, and we never know other people's pleasures and pains. But the question becomes practically of terribly great significance. Consider that you're in a city council and you have this problem. There is an area of beautiful land beside a lake. You have to decide how to use it. You've got two choices. You could divide it into lots for building. And in doing so, not only would you increase the property value of the land because you'd be getting taxes from it, but also you'd be providing a rather rich source of satisfaction over a long period of time to, say, 40 families who would build their own homes and could live their lives looking at the lake and living with the lake and with nature. On the other hand, you could reserve that land for a public park. And in doing that, maybe thousands of people would come to visit for an hour or two. But they would serving the greater number less intensely be more valuable than giving this land to the few people who would experience an intense satisfaction from having a home by the lake. Well, it comes up all the time in city council meetings and land use planning sessions. Bentham, you were asking the right question. We know we have to compare those two, but Bentham or modern economics gives us little guidance on how to do it. The problem with modern economics is that it tends to reduce many of these factors of cost and benefits to monetary measures. And sometimes that can lead to some peculiar results. For example, consider the problem of the preservation of wilderness areas. Now, up on the border between Minnesota and the province of Ontario in Canada, there's an area larger than the state of Delaware, the Quetico Superior National Forest, which you can only get into by canoe. It's reserved for canoeists. A huge piece of public land that is outside of the realm of development. And the Secretary of Interior of the previous administration, and many like him, argued that this really was a use of land, of public land, that didn't pass the philific calculus at all. For there's timber on that land and some mineral resources. And if you open the land up for conventional tourism, recreational vehicles, fishing, see, the only way you can get in there right now is by canoe. You've got to paddle or you don't go. If you open it up, many, many more people could enjoy it. And just any monetary calculation would say that you were adding more to the general welfare, to the greatest good for the greatest number, if you made those timber resources available. That would create jobs in an impoverished part of the state of Minnesota. It would create timber that the society needs and ores that society needs for economic growth. It would give recreational opportunities for many people who do not have them. And you can figure out on a cost-benefit analysis basis that of the 10,000, or I guess it's more than that, but say 10,000 or so people who take canoe trips up there every summer, if you take the value of that land for all other purposes, the taxpayers of the United States are subsidizing each canoe trip to the tune of $100,000 or so. Well, you look at that and you begin to say, how do you value the wilderness? If all pleasures and pains are created equal, how do you measure the value of the canoe trip against the value of the timber, the jobs, and so forth? And you begin to wonder if this is all right. Or take another question. It's a frequent one in cost-benefit analysis. what is the value of a human life? Well, the answer, if you ask a highway engineer, is $186,000. And you may blink a little, and I'll tell you how this is done. You reach a question when you're trying to decide which highways to straighten out so as to prevent accidents. There are curves in highways in the state of Wisconsin, and accidents are caused. So the question is, where are your priorities? You have limited funds. Which one should you straighten out? Well, you do costs and benefit analysis. You know the costs of doing it. What are the benefits of making a safer highway? Well, less accidents, less property damage, but fewer people killed. Well, how much is a human life worth? Well, actually, the way it's done is by a very interesting calculation which fits perfectly with what Jeremy Bentham taught. A person's worth is what they will contribute to society, what they will contribute to the happiness of others. And how do you measure that? Well, it's the income they will receive over a lifetime, right? And that's a measure in a market economy, in a free economy, of what your services are worth to somewhere else. Now, it turns out a few years ago that if you calculated the lifetime earnings of the average individual, it would come out to about $186,000. It's probably a little more right now. So you take that number and you plug it into the cost-benefit analysis by estimating how many lives you're apt to save in straightening out this curve on the road somewhere in rural Wisconsin. And if the number comes out ahead of the costs, you straighten the road, and if it doesn't, you don't. So far, so good, right? Except it can get a little tricky if you get any more perfect than that. For example, this means that if you create unsafe highways in front of nursing homes, where the people have already retired and are no longer contributing to the gross national product, that you're actually accentuating the cost-benefit analysis. And it's really highly beneficial to society to bump off the oldsters by building these unsafe highways past the nursing homes. Now, you may think that's funny and nobody would ever do it. But the Federal Aviation Administration once argued that preference should be given to making the airways safer than the highways on the ground that air travelers earned more in higher incomes than people who drove cars, and therefore had greater income, and therefore led to society to a greater good if you protected the air traveler rather than the highway traveler. All right, at the far extreme of Benthamism and utilitarianism and cost-benefit analysis lies a kind of madness. And we run into it every day in public administration and policy analysis in this society. And you'll hear this language because echoes of Jeremy Bentham are everywhere around you. You hear them from the administration as it plans its budget. You hear it from your local city council as it thinks of public works. And be aware that it's a very difficult art, and it can be very helpful, but in some cases, we have pushed Bentham beyond the line. He dreamed of something we have never figured out how to realize. Now, there are a lot of problems besides that with Bentham. The idea that the whole object of society is to maximize happiness leads to some questions. Happiness is a funny word. I mean, it leads one to think of a comfortable consumer society. Is the real object of society to just make people more content, more satisfied, more well-off? Is the highest gross national product what we should be striving for? All of those questions that you know very well do follow in some way from the utilitarian version of liberalism. Now, a couple of more further comments. Utilitarianism and market liberalism. In one sense, the market and utilitarianism go together, because the classic liberal will argue that that a perfect market equals perfect utilitarianism. In other words, if all people in a perfect market society have invested their personal resources so as to achieve the greatest possible reward, and if each has chosen those goods that will best yield happiness, a perfect market also achieves perfect utilitarianism. Incidentally, if any of you are interested, that's called Pareto optimality in technical economics language. But it means that some economists argue that the perfect market is also perfect utilitarianism. However, utilitarianism and classic liberalism are different emphases, really, within the liberal tradition. The state in utilitarianism is more positive. It exists not merely to protect rights or to correct for market failure, but to adopt policies that make society happier, better, that serve the satisfaction of the people. You don't have to prove market failure, you see, in order to seek a policy in which the benefits to society outweigh the costs. It's a very wide open policy, a very wide open test of good government policy, which can justify a lot of forms of intervention in the economy and in society, which classic liberalism cannot. Another thing I suppose that should be said is that utilitarianism looks like a more public-spirited form of liberalism than classic liberalism. There's a selfishness to Lockean or Adam Smith's rational individual, always pursuing self-interest, somehow hoping that institutions will create public interest out of private interest. But notice that the utilitarian individual is not supposed to be pursuing just calculated self-interest or even Locke's enlightened self-interest. That individual is pursuing a social goal, the greatest good for the greatest number. And in fact, one could argue that he or she should support a law or a policy that produces the general welfare, even if he or she does not benefit personally. The other side of this is that utilitarianism can be hard on minority rights. If exploiting a small group, be they the rich or the poor, the talented or the untalented, can help the greatest good to be realized, such a policy is in order. So slavery of a small group could be consistent with this principle. You could enslave 10% of the population and they might yield the greatest good of the greatest number for the other 90%. Or it might be consistent, say, with requiring professors to work for a minimum wage or doctors to work for a minimum wage, if that can yield the greatest good for the greatest number. So it's not a test that's completely compatible with all the things that we generally believe in the name of liberalism. In any event, Bentham is as contemporary as Smith, Locke, or Madison. For better or for worse, our everyday thought about political economy often takes the form of Bentham's philippic calculus, that we barely remember his name, or the name of his funny formula for what he was doing. But the peculiar little British philosopher is very much alive and influential, and you can hear his voice in every public hearing, budget deliberation, city council meeting, and in whatever you learn in the Department of Economics or Political Science in this university. Now, today we are studying a very great man and a very great book, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. In a way, it pulls together our whole discussion of the rise of liberal thought, which is what we've been doing for the last, well, for most of the semester so far. And here in a few pages, you capture and distill the essence of the message in a lot of ways. At the same time, Mill leads the way into what is yet to come. He begins a new conversation, a conversation that involves Karl Marx to some extent, but more importantly, the thought of the 20th century. There's a straight line between John Stuart Mill, John Dewey, pragmatism, the thought of our era, and that too we're going to explore. And John Stuart Mill does some remarkable things to the whole idea of liberalism in this book that we haven't studied so far. For the last few weeks in particular, since we left Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, we've been dealing with technical liberalism, with the political economy of liberalism and the straight politics of it. We've been talking about markets and commodities and exchange and supply and demand. And we've been talking about cost-benefit analysis, and we've been talking about constitutional structures. And in a way, we've been looking at the details, the plumbing of liberal society, the nuts and bolts of it. Now, if we get too close to that, and we stay there, liberalism becomes all technique, and it ceases to be philosophy, and it ceases to have a higher image and a higher vision. And so in looking at John Stuart Mill, we're also talking about a man who understood liberalism as a concept for a civilization, as a way of thinking about not just politics and economics, but about the whole life of society, about the arts, about science. And it's all, believe it or not, in those few pages of On Liberty. Well, before we talk about the book and about Mill's ideas, and incidentally, it's John Stuart Mill, M-I-L-L. I don't know why, but everybody seems to say it Mills, but it's not Mills. It's John Stuart Mill in the singular. There's a sociologist named C. Wright Mills, but he's a different person altogether. Now, before we start talking about his book, let's talk a little bit about the man, his life, his era. Now, he's related, John Stuart Mill is related to utilitarianism and to Jeremy B. Bentham very directly. He thought of himself as a utilitarian. He thought of himself as working in the tradition of Jeremy Bentham. He was very much part of the whole reform mood and movement of British politics in the 1830, 1840 period, leading into the 1850s and 1860s, actually. But he quarreled with Bentham. His views are not the same as Bentham's. And it's in the tension and the development of the basic Bentham, thought of Bentham that you find the uniqueness and the original creation of John Stuart Mill. Now, actually, there are two Mills that are known to history, John Stuart Mill and his father, James Mill. And James Mill was really the one who was closer to Jeremy Bentham. He's the father of John Stuart Mill. He was a liberal politician, a publicist, something of a gadfly. But I suppose, in a way, his main historic achievement, James Mill this is, was the education of John Stuart Mill, because he decided that he would raise John Stuart Mill in the best tradition of liberalism and utilitarianism as almost an experiment in the creative manufacture of a person who would be systematic and rational. I mean, here we have this vision of liberal education. We have this idea of the free-thinking, rationally choosing individual. We created a whole system of public education. Well, James Mill went to work on John Stuart Mill and tried to create the perfect incarnation of the liberally educated man, the person who was prepared to be a liberal because he would know everything, would be a free thinker, would be free to choose in the fullest sense of that phrase. Well, the consequence was that John Stuart Mill read Greek at the age of 3, Latin at the age of 8. He understood mathematics and philosophy very well by the age of 11. He was an adult in argument by the time he was 12, and one gets these pictures of him being a totally insufferable brat around the house. I mean, James Mill would have some of the good politicians over to dinner, and there would be little old John Stuart, the child prodigy, besting them in argument about the principles of utilitarianism, making a general nuisance and annoyance of himself. And of course, by the age of 20, he had a nervous breakdown, thereby proving what a liberal education will get you. He went to work for the British government in the India House. He was active in the intellectual life of London as an essayist and critic, but he sort of wandered for a long time. And he met and married a fine woman, Harriet Taylor, who was a close inspiration and collaborator of his. I mean, they just, they were just always together in their ideas, in their minds. Mill was an old-fashioned philosopher. He's not a specialist. He thought about everything of his times: logic, religion, political economy, art, and politics. And his essays reflect these extremely broad interests. And then in the in the 1850s, somehow he had something like a midlife crisis, I guess, but he just set forth an heroic writing plan. All of his life came together. I mean, he was in his mid-40s. He really hadn't accomplished a great deal until then. And in 8 years, he wrote 6 great books: Utilitarianism, On Liberty, his autobiography, Nature, The Utility of Religion, Reflections on Representative Government. All of these just spew out, all of them beautifully written, many of them quite complicated, all of them in a very small period of time. 8 books in 6 years. And I just think of that in kind of awe. I mean, those of us who can barely manage to write a book every presidential term or so, you know, it's just hard to imagine how you could do something like that. In that brief span of time, he was able to accomplish so much. Well, the one that we've looked at, because in some ways it's the most appealing and in many ways very central to his thought, is On Liberty. And we can almost go through it. It's such a closely structured argument, and see what Mill is trying to say there. It begins as a political argument, but it broadens into an argument about so many different things. Now, as you've read it, you begin to see how he sets up the problem, how he characterizes the situation. And he begins with a political proposition that throughout history, man had assumed that the problem of politics was an antagonism between the rulers and the ruled. And that the problem, and you see this, of course, all through the courses we've taken it so far, from Plato to Aristotle on down, how do you justify government? How do you justify the idea that some people will rule and others will be ruled? Under what conditions is that legitimate? What is a good society? But it's always a sense of separation. As we've said so many times this semester, the classic problem of liberalism was the prevention of tyranny. But now Mill says the world has changed. This might have been the problem for the 1600s and the 1700s, but by 1859, liberalism had become dominant. It was no longer a dream, it was now very much a reality. And with liberalism came its own problems. British society, more so America, had become democracies. And now, at least in theory, the rulers were the ruled. Since the old problem of tyranny of one ruling class over society had been obliterated. But now we faced a new question, which was the problem of democracy itself. And that is the problem of what a people can do to an individual. Can the majority do anything? Is the rule of the people, if the people are sovereign, if they have a right to rule themselves, do they have a right to do anything in that name? Now, we've seen a variety of answers to this. You know, Locke's that they do not. Locke's that government only exists to protect individual rights. But Rousseau's very different answer, that government can legitimately rest on a general will, which emerges out of the interaction, the deliberations of the people as they form a community. This concerned John Stuart Mill, and in On Liberty, he is returning somewhat to Locke's problem, but now in the guise of utilitarianism, and asking, where does the individual fit in the scheme of democracy? Now, it was a problem for utilitarian theory. As you remember, Bentham argued that the principle of good legislation, of scientific liberal legislation, ought to be that government do the greatest good for the greatest number. And this, as we said last time, is a very social principle. It commands the individual to think not of one's enlightened self-interest, one's rights, but to think of the social good. And in a sense, it's a principle of self-sacrifice. One ought to work for the general welfare, for the general happiness. Now, John Stuart Mill was concerned that the utilitarian principle, the democratic principle, the right of the community to govern itself, this communitarian ethic could displace an individualistic one and that utilitarianism bore within itself a threat to the individual. Well, as he begins to analyze his problem, he suggests that there is a test of legitimate democratic government beyond pure majority rule. And as you'll see as you read the book, he sets up the argument this way. It is not just the right of the majority that is in question to govern. It is not just the sovereignty of the people. There is a limit to what they can do. And the limit is set by a right that we might call the right of privacy, the right of individuality, which Mill expressed in what he called the harm principle. That the only thing that can be properly regulated by society are individual acts that do harm to others. There is a clear distinction, Mill argued, between actions that concern only oneself and actions that concern others. Okay, that looks pretty clear when you first think about it. If you're just walking down the street minding your own business, doesn't seem to be something subject to regulation. You don't affect other people. But if you're going to go out and drive a car at high rates of speeds down a sidewalk, that can conceivably harm other people, and that is legitimately something that the society can regulate. Looks very clear. You know, the old saying, "My freedom stops where your nose begins," expresses that rather elegantly. But the more you think about that, the more difficult and contentious this principle becomes, because almost every case is a marginal case and a hard one to weigh. For example, in a free enterprise system, you've got 3 businesses operating on Main Street, 3 filling stations. One cuts its prices, offers better services, all kinds of things, and drives the other 2 businesses out of business and becomes a monopoly. Well, monopoly causes its own problem, but in a way, the people who own those other 2 businesses have been harmed. They've been driven into bankruptcy. They've been impoverished by the competitive activities of party number 1. Is this a harm? Or ask another question. Is it legitimate for a society to, if you choose to put up a large pornographic statue in your backyard of some kind or another just because you think it's excellent art in your own taste, and it is offensive to your neighbor's sensibilities, and your neighbor's got to look at this thing and is embarrassed every time he or she sees it, is that a harm? Well, it isn't something you do physically to the person. It doesn't look at all like injuring, killing somebody. It isn't a deprivation of life or liberty. It isn't exploitation in that sense. What does one make of it? Most of our law, in a lot of ways, is determining that line between privacy and acts that hurt other people, harm other people, affect other people's interests. And since almost everything we do will have some impact on other people, these lines become very hard to draw. And so Mill's test that he proposed, though we use it, it's as much as the cost-benefit analysis, part of our equipment, the tools of our civilization, it really doesn't work all that very well. Now, if you think of all the things you do that affect other people, that help them for better or for worse, what you say and what you believe fits into a very special category. And if you are to, say things that are libelous or harmful to people, if you talk behind people's backs, injure their reputation, again, you're not doing them a physical harm. But in some sense, you're affecting them. But think more broadly. If you speak in the public realm, as Socrates once did, against the religion or the customs of the people, you may be loosening the bonds of society. You may be harming people. If you teach liberal education in a university and ask people to rethink their values, the traditions that their parents taught them, you may be doing some deep harm to the integrity of families, of expectations of elders for their parents, of just the cement of a total society. There are many things you do by what you say that could be construed as harms to other people or could not. And it's on this problem that Mill chose to focus in on liberty, because he singles out speech and conscience as the most important points. Well, there are lots of things that are questions of human freedom in liberalism. Liberalism, as we've discussed it so far, has had mainly to do with freedom of choice among alternatives. This occupation or that, this product in the marketplace or that, this course in the university or that. We've seen how Adam Smith's logic, like that of the utilitarians, flows from the notion that society should take its form from the acts of a freely choosing, rationally calculating individual. So what happens when you put special emphasis on speech and conscience? How does it change the argument in general ways? And in what sense is this a special case of privacy? Why is it particularly damaging for society to regulate speech and conscience? Why does that make more difference than other things? It doesn't, it isn't altogether obvious. We take it for granted. And it isn't that speech is trivial compared to other things in life, that what you say doesn't matter. Now, Mill's facing the problem quite directly because he's worried again about the power of the majority, about the power of democracy. And if you go back to the classic tradition that we studied in the first semester, the issue is really this. Why shouldn't a society then be able to decide what is good and bad? Why shouldn't a society, through legislation, define its own morality? And why shouldn't government enforce notions of good and bad behavior? Why shouldn't you be able to legislate morality? If you take a totally relativist view, a totally skeptical view, that there is no absolute truth or there is no nature, then what you believe to be good and bad is a product of your civilization. And if the glue that holds civilization together is its basic value system, well, why shouldn't that be a political question? Put it another way. If society truly believes that stealing or that certain kinds of beliefs, certain kinds of attitudes, don't take stealing for a moment, but certain beliefs, certain attitudes, a belief in atheism is simply wrong, that to go against God's will is wrong, why shouldn't it require people to be members of a church? The Ayatollah Khomeini believes that. If the will of Allah is truth, then for heaven's sake it is the duty of the ruler to rule that way. This, of course, was the belief of the Middle Ages. It is the duty of the ruler, the Christian ruler, to be the champion of the faith, and that means to support the church. But go beyond that and make an even more complex argument out of it. Shouldn't the liberal ruler enforce liberalism? If you believe in freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, if you believe in all the set of presuppositions that we've studied that follow from Hobbes and Locke and Newton and so forth, should we not then enforce liberalism as a law, require people to be tolerant of one another, reduce intolerance? Should that not be a subject of public legislation? Should not people have their consciousness raised so that they treat minorities with greater respect? Should not people be required by the law to treat people that they otherwise hate, other races, as equivalent to themselves?
Is this like Rousseau's idea that we have to force people to be free?
Is this like Rousseau's idea that we have to force people to be free? It is precisely like that idea of Rousseau, that if the general will is an expression of the common beliefs and values of a society rationally considered, then what right does a person have to say, I dissent I just won't do it this way, especially if the ground of dissent is, I just think this is, I just don't feel like doing it this way. My own interests compel me to do something else. So it is against this notion that Mill is going to argue. And let's see how he builds his argument. Now, the first problem that, well, as Mill addresses this problem, his question takes him not so much to the rights of individuals, but oddly enough to the question of truth itself. And here you see, lingering behind this argument about freedom of speech, not anything that has to do with individual right, but a question of science, basically, and scientific method. Because if one asks, how does one know that a given opinion, a given morality is true or not? Mill would answer, well, the majority doesn't know that. And Mill would answer, some pre-selected priestly class doesn't know that. How in the world then do we know that a morality or any views about the world are true? And the only way we can do it is by rational demonstration, rational proof, evidence, argument, experience. Evidence meaning laboratory conditions, the argument from the facts of the case presented to the individual. Secondly, logic, rational argument. But third, experience, what happens in one's own life. And experience will become very important to Mill, as it will later to the American pragmatists. Now, if we use public pressure to do this, if we coerce somebody into saying that something's true, we've done two things. One, we've gone against the rules of scientific method. We have said this is true because we say we do, because you're required to believe it. We are not giving you an argument. We are not giving evidence. We are not showing you why it is true. And in a sense, then, we are enforcing an opinion, which may or may not be true. We are giving no proof of its truth. And therefore, we are simply dealing in the realm of enforcing ideas, opinions. We are not necessarily enforcing the truth on people. Now, what is the thing that is deserving of higher respect? The mere opinion of the majority or truth? Well, in the scientific world in which Mill lives, what is important is evidence, truth, persuasion. Hence, a society may persuade one another. You may argue with one another. You may show evidence with one another, but you cannot compel belief. To do that would be just a complete repudiation of everything that truth itself means in the scientific age. Now, Mill's second argument for why freedom of speech is special and why it should be protected against the majority, against regulation of any kind, is not just, and you see what's happening here, it's a very interesting argument, this first argument. Mill is arguing that politics is like science, that this political community is like the scientific community in special respects. And as the scientific community has no right to enforce, say, Newton's laws of physics on the society, what's good science? It's Newton. Of course, we do that all the time in university, don't we? I mean, we say, this is the truth. Here are Newton's laws. Answer it on the examination or flunk. I mean, maybe, and that's kind of a problem along that line. But the scientific community has no right to do that. The only right of scientific authority is that which comes through rational persuasion. All right, by the same token, a political community has no right to do that. And for Mill, a political community should proceed like a scientific community by experiment. And experiment means testing ideas, testing hypotheses, testing theories in the life of that community. Mill's second argument is kind of an interesting one for freedom of speech. And this is that truth only becomes important in the presence of opposition. The example he gives is Christianity, because he was speaking to an age, this is really an argument that's designed for his obvious opponents, the church. The church is horrified, of course, by his doctrine, the Anglican Church, that you should permit the teaching of atheism, that you should permit the teaching of all sorts of beliefs that are counter to Christianity. And so Mill directs his second argument specifically at the clergy, the Christian part of his civilization, and he says this: if Christianity were the only system of thought that anybody knew, it would become trite, banal, and totally unimportant. Christianity thrives best as a religion under conditions of relative oppression. Incidentally, most Christians believe this. You have to discover the truth of Christianity. You have to, in some sense, be converted or born again. You have to find that the ways of the world are not sufficient. And out of understanding that your secular materialist point of view is not as good as Christianity, then you endorse Christianity. But you see, for Christianity to become important, you have to have this secular, humanist, materialist point of view to rebel against. Well, take it out, that's the example Mill gives, but let's expand it. The same is true of any system of belief. For example, in this course, we are working desperately hard to remove our whole liberal value system from the realm of the conventional. When you walked in here and I said, do you believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? You'd say, no, oh sure, ho-hum, what else is new? Give me another banality tomorrow. We are so used to these cliches of liberalism that we never think of them as important. To become important, Mill would argue, you have to see them in contrast to alternatives. That's perhaps why in a course like this, you build it up through contrasts with other systems of thought. You look at how the Middle Ages was organized. You look at what liberalism rebelled against. In a strange sense, one might argue you would have to have Nazism, you have to have communism to make liberal values seem important. The rights of we talk about freedom of speech, the rights of the individual. Doesn't matter to you in the least, doesn't really mean a thing to you. All I can say is, spend a couple of weeks in the Soviet Union or in a Latin American dictatorship, and all at once you get the idea. Back in the days when Spain was under Franco, I suddenly understood what it was all about on encountering a Spanish policeman who, was not about to take what I said in any way, and figuring out that rights of appeal and rights of lawyers were not in the cards, and that I might very well go to jail for no apparent reason unless I did what he said. Experiences that happen over and over again. So Mill says, why do you permit error in a society? Well, one reason is so that the truth will stand out. And that's an interesting argument all by itself. Watch it when it comes up in the book, because it's kind of apparent. Now, all of this argument about the special character of freedom of speech, of why a society in which everybody believes that Marxism is wrong ought to protect the right of Marxists overall, why a Judeo-Christian society ought to protect the rights of atheists above rights, why a society that deplores Nazism ought to permit Nazis to be you give Nazis special privileges in making their case for racism and the idea that Jews and blacks are not quite human and so forth. All of these things that we deplore, Mill thinks are the most important rights to be protected. The right of the dissenter, the right of the person who isn't approved, the right of the person who speaks for things that are utterly distasteful. And the reasons that he does this are twofold in nature and very, very important. Now, the first, of course, is related to liberal relativism, skepticism, and truth. That liberalism can claim no truth except that which the individual believes. Now, as I said, over and over again, perhaps to the point of monotony, liberalism's first assumption is that there's only one source of value, that's the individual. No one can say what's good for another person. Well, that seems to reduce all of society to just individual choice, to having no values at all. But now with Mill, we see the reintroduction of a system of values. Society is not just individual choice, but it's an argument, an ongoing argument about what's good and what is bad. And that's what freedom of speech is all about. An argument about morality, an argument about values, an argument about religion, an argument about politics, and an argument about economics, and an argument about truth and falsity in the scientific sense. Now, that argument is going on, and it's being tested in the eyes of the people. To proclaim one truth and one truth alone stops that argument dead in its tracks. So the important thing is to keep it going. For that reason, you have to permit the unconventional opinion to exist because it might be right. You have to at least have the view that the conventional morality might be mistaken. You might be in error, and that the truth may lie elsewhere. A fundamental belief of science, but now this becomes also a fundamental belief of religion, of politics, and of religion. And so you have to say to the Christian, there might be a better religion than Christianity coming along. And you have to say to the liberal, Nazism might be correct. You at least have to listen to the arguments, and society has to be open to that argument. There is a case that it might be. You have to think that your present beliefs might be displaced by somebody else. And in the beginning, the person who speaks for those things will be a very small minority, will be persecuted, and so the state and politics have to stand up for that right of dissent on the ground of truth, on the ground of inquiry. Now, this leads to a sense of progress. This is the only way you're going to discover truth. If the society holds the argument steady at one point and enforces a certain opinion, you're never going to advance scientifically, intellectually, morally, any other way. And so what Mill is saying implicitly is that there can be progress in matters of religion, progress in matters of morality, progress in matters of politics, and it's open-ended. We don't know where this is all going. But the society should be organized like a great experiment. And that is the reason that freedom of speech is important, to keep the experiment alive. And values are going to emerge, and they're going to be controversial, but the society that permits this argument to go on over time is going to reach a higher level of values, a higher level of civilization. Not just greater prosperity, not just more freedom, but it's going to come closer to the truth. Because by testing rival ideas against one another in the light of reason, evidence, and experience, it is going to come to better scientific theories, better religions, better politics than a society that doesn't do that. That's argument number one. Now, this argument takes Mill directly into an argument with Jeremy Bentham's ideas that all pleasures and pains are created equal. You remember we talked about that last time. Bentham starts from the notion, a nice notion, of human equality, but also a notion that one cannot judge anybody else's satisfactions. Poetry is as good as pushpin. Listening to the symphony is no better or worse than watching a demolition derby on television. Anything you happen to like is your own satisfaction. No one else can judge it. Now, this is kind of a problem for utilitarianism in its primitive form, because it seems to create a picture of a rather crass society, a society that averages down to the lowest common denominator. And one wonders if such a society can be called a civilization, or whether you're just not talking about pure consumerism, mass markets, appeal to the mass publics. Well, Mill dissents from Bentham on this point. He says you don't have to leave it there. Utilitarianism doesn't have to stop with people's present pleasures and just realize whatever they want, this kind of hedonistic society of give people whatever pleasures they want. That society, in effect, is a search for higher values. And the way it works is that in a pluralist society where there are many alternatives, and people who are exposed to a variety of alternatives have a chance to participating in them, will know from experience the higher from the lower. Experience requires maturity, and experience often requires instruction. But at the same time, we come to see over time that some things are better than others. So what Mill pictures is an individual, in answer to Bentham, is that the individual who was once satisfied, and you say, well, there's no comparing, let's say, the beauty and splendor of a sunset in the North Woods with a lawn full of plastic flamingos in a suburban tract development in Florida. Somebody likes plastic flamingos. They're just as good as a sunset in the Rocky Mountains. Somebody likes, all a matter of taste. But Mill would say, no, if you take that person who's enraptured with plastic flamingos and take them into the wilderness and let them see the silence and the serenity, they're going to know the difference, and they can't come home again. Once you know the higher thing, the higher value, then you won't go back. You will prefer it. Bach versus rock and roll. It may take experience, it may take instruction, you may have to see the point. But if you really, take popular, crass music and compare it to the classics, person who knows and understands both will prefer the higher thing. Well, you say a residual skepticism comes to your mind. Some people will never understand Bach or nature in a poetic, total way. But that doesn't mean that there are not higher values nonetheless, because a person who has appreciated both, who has understood both, will always prefer the higher values. Now, what follows from this? A society that is open to experience, then, will, in the long run, progress toward a higher state of civilization. There's almost a sense of Aristotle in what we're saying here, that man has higher needs and lower needs. And a society that begins to concentrate just on the lower needs, sex, food, shelter, clothing, once those are fulfilled, will rise to higher needs. And from experience in alternatives, it will begin to pick them. A society that emphasizes only material comfort, if the alternative of a fuller, richer life is available, people will begin to choose it. And that second alternative will begin to represent society. But for that to happen, freedom has to be allowed to those who represent new possibilities, new things. Some will fail. Some will be lower values. Some will turn out to be terrible ideas in time. But some ideas that start as unimportant, as trivial, as insignificant, or as condemned by society will turn out by those who experience both of them to be the better thing over time. And Mill had a great faith, you see, in human rationality, human nature, and human creativity, that if you just permitted an elite to operate, an elite that was cultivated, an elite that was sophisticated to operate, that they would make these things available to society. So there was a sense of responsibility here, a sense of responsibility for the sophisticated, the enlightened, the rational, to argue the case for better values, not to be satisfied with the status quo, not to be satisfied with the taste of the average individual. On the other hand, the elite had no right to coerce the average individual into going to symphony concerts or going out in the wilderness and looking at a sunset, here, like it or else, see your darn plastic flamingos, stare at that sunset until you really enjoy it. No, of course not. All you could do was argue the case. All you could do was make the case. In science, through reason, in art, through demonstration and appreciation, in morality, through discussion and through discourse. And so, in the long run, an open society, a society that permitted dissent, would, in fact, progress. Now, Mill then laid the way open for the eccentric individual. He particularly applauded the individual who went against the grain, who didn't conform with society, because that individual might be the bearer of a good idea, or of a higher form of morality, religion, society, whatever it might be. An entrepreneur, not just in the economic sense, but an entrepreneur of a new religion, a new association, a new form of science, knowledge, whatever it may happen to be. He has expanded the idea of the marketplace to all of civilization. The marketplace tells you that freedom of choice among goods and services will yield the greatest good for the greatest number, and will create progress, because you will always be getting a better product. Mill, in effect, is saying you could apply the same thing to art, science, religion, culture in general, and that requires speech and expression rather than trade. And just as the ideal of the marketplace honors the entrepreneur, the creator of a new invention or a new product, so Mill's vision of freedom honors the eccentric individual who comes up with a new idea that is at first hated by his society. As I say, Mill is an individualist in the classic liberal fashion. He returns to a utilitarian theme. The purpose of society can only be individual self-fulfillment. But ultimately, Mill sees self-fulfillment, as I suggested, more in an Aristotelian sense, a realization of one's higher potentialities rather than one's appetites. He's leaving the liberal tradition a little bit with its pleasure-pain principle and moving more to an Aristotelian idea that man has an infinite capacity for fulfillment, that man has higher pleasures, potentialities, possibilities for living. But we can only learn this in a free society, in the presence of alternatives, one that is as open to poetry and religious mysticism as it is to materialism and economic rationality. Well, what then of the role of government? The harm principle itself would seem to be consistent with Locke's idea of a negative government and of a merely passive government that restricted individual liberty as little as possible. The only thing that government should regulate are those acts that cause harm to one another. And that looks like the criminal law, the civil law, property law. Just the old triad that Adam Smith believed in and others. And in this way, Mill seems to be going back to a negative conception or a passive conception of government, more like Adam Smith and classic liberalism than like modern liberalism. On the other hand, as we noted, because of the very ambiguity of the harm principle, it opens the door to a lot of regulation. It depends on what society regards as a harm. If depriving homosexuals of rights to society is harmful to them, if society is harming them, then government should intervene to protect their rights. If the activities of capitalists harm workers, exploit them, deprive them of their health, their well-being, some sense of their property perhaps, then government should intervene on their behalf. But particularly, government should intervene to keep the argument open and going in all realms of life, to protect the freedom and autonomy of science, of inquiry, of speech, against the community. So that now, where we began, Mill saying the old problem was to prevent tyranny, to prevent government from thwarting the rights of the individual. Then we reach a stage where we say government should be the people. Now he says government should protect the individual against the people. And that the real threat is not majority tyranny, meaning laws are passed. The real threat comes from backyard gossips, public opinion, what everybody thinks should be done. Government has a special need to protect the rights of the creative people in society. Mill then is an elitist as much as he is a Democrat. And he broadens the idea of liberalism, as I say, from political economy to something that more resembles a doctrine of civilization.